Okay, we'll get started in just a second. Okay, hello everyone, welcome. My name is Robert. Let's go ahead and get started. This is Enslaved, Washington, D.C., 1790 to 2021. Just to make sure everyone's in the right place, let's go ahead and get underway. We always welcome, oops, hold on, jumped a slide ahead. We always welcome people to introduce themselves. If you want to tell us in the chat or the Q&A, if you're watching us on Zoom, or in the comment section if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to introduce yourselves. You can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and if you've ever lived in or visited Washington, D.C. And we don't have time to do a Zoom demonstration, but just real quick, usually there's only two things that people want to know how to do. One is adjust the sound. So everyone will be in listen only mode except for myself and our distinguished guest. If you want to raise or lower the sound on your session, you can check the settings locally on your device. The screen display, if the slides that we're showing you want them to take up the full screen, you can look for something called view or view options and click off the side-by-side mode. Throughout our program today, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring that. And if you have any technical problems, please let us know. For those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. Our mission is to bring people together to experience the history and culture of Washington, D.C. And I will be not your host really, but more of like your MC. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'm the founder and director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. And at the end of the program later on, we'll have a recording of this on our YouTube page. So if you have to jump off, or if you want to listen to it again, or you know someone that else that might be interested, we are recording this and it'll be up on our YouTube page along with a variety of other programs we've previously recorded. And I'll send out an email for that a little bit later. But with that, I want to turn things over to our distinguished guest. So Ed, it is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen. Give me a minute to do this real quick. And I think we are set.
I can see your screen perfectly.
Yeah, but I can't, you should be able to just see this part.
Oh, it looks like it's the slide you want to show. It says Enslaved Washington, D.C., 1790 to 2021, an unscrubbed history.
And that's the only thing you see?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Good. Folks, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ed, as Robert mentioned, teaching at Georgetown for more years than I can think about. The most important voices this afternoon are yours, and it's a tough topic. There's no question on that, even for somebody who has lived here as long as I have. Lots might be familiar somewhat. It's a tough topic to handle and deal with. Please be safe emotionally, and as you're sewing this, if you have any questions, any kind of comments at all, as Robert will say, I'll be able to talk to you after the presentation. I can be easily reached by email. I'm delighted that you have honored me and us with your presence. It's a good learning that we are doing in general, and I thank you. This is an unscrubbed history, and it's about the enslaved Washington, D.C., starting in 1790. And if you know if you were listening to Hamilton, you have a better sense of the story and what it's actually about. The District of Columbia was called then the Federal City, was created to demonstrate the political might of the new nation's slaver power. The location was a compromise between North and South over war debt and the power of slavery. Actually, it was not so much a compromise because the North really didn't get as much as they thought they were going to get. They did get war debt paid, but they did not receive much else, and we'll see about that. The examination of the laws and practices, social customs, and persons that make the federal city is part of a wider project that I'm doing, examining Anglo-colonial enslavement practice in the islands and colonies and states, and at the end of this session, white race apartheid. And this is intended to be a walking tour of the district. Inshallah, we shall be able to do that at some point soon. Some necessary background that we're going to be looking through, the origins of the federal city, a little bit of kind of a geeky kind of history. Selling humans for cash, looking at what might be called and is called the domestic trade and in slavery. And I don't like to use that particular term, and I'll explain why. The power of words, slave power, the Constitution, and the presidents. And probably what most people have joined for, unrepresented and stateless, living enslaved in the District of Columbia. Who built the city? We built the city, and the people, and the case for restorative justice. So we start. Cultures are structures. They're materials and words and actions and habits. Cultures absorb memory as stones absorb heat. Cultures have a gravitational weight. History casts shadows. We walk in patterned light and dark. This afternoon, this is a partial look at the shadow of the federal city. We'll be looking at the slave pits and auction blocks on O Street, Northwest, Wisconsin, right in Georgetown. We'll look at Senator John Kennedy aside, who purchases the property in Georgetown and purchases it with a race exclusion restriction on it. Enslaved remains that they're finding in Georgetown itself. And we look at Mount Zion Cemetery, unnamed and unmarked, and where Black Americans were buried. And I'll talk about my practice by calling them Black rather than slaves in a moment. We'll think about Georgetown Market, we know as Dean and DeLuca. We'll talk about the Capitol, and Freedom Statue, and Washington Monument built by enslaved. We'll talk about the Black surveyor of the district who had to live in a tent while Jefferson and Washington were in a hotel in Georgetown. Talk about Georgetown Harbor, which is one of two, Alexandria being the other, major sources of both the distribution and the arrival of enslaved African persons. We'll talk about the contraband camps in Georgetown and up in Federal District near the White House, where escaped enslaved persons from the South would come trying to find freedom in the North. And they were called enslaved by the government, who said, well, they're the property, so we're keeping them. And we look at Betty's auction block and Roby's slave pen within eyesight of the Capitol, the Smithsonian Castle built by enslaved and enslaved with the family of George Washington's wife, Martha. We'll look at the yellow slaver house pen across the street from the Hirshhorn. There's a lot to cover. We only do this not with so much justice as really quickly a once over. So think of this as an archaeology of the federal city. Who built it? Out of what stolen materials? What remains visible, as well as the shadows in which all of us still walk? What happened to these stateless persons? What happened to all of us who walk among the evidences of these dead daily, in law and in our neighborhoods, in our practices, without understanding or seeing the shadow of these lives? As Hamilton reminds us, who's got skin in the game? Likely it's not ours. Axiomatic, the kind of things that I run my life by, maxims. Soft power, as I will talk to in my cultural studies classes. Soft power is the kind of the congratulatory and demeaning methods that we use to elevate those who lack material power. Mother's Day, for example, is an example one. It's usually gendered, and women, in my hearing, understand this better than the men, probably. It's a way of talking to people who lack access to real power by flattering their greatness nonetheless. Lauding DC as, quote, the Black cultural capital is an example of this. And you cannot read Washington history without seeing Washington's actual history scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. And as you'll see, what comes up is kind of a parody of a city. My presentation this afternoon is not about soft power. It's about how the Washington, DC persons still move and the city in chains, enslaved and powerless, unrepresented, the citizens of all its ethnicities, and still. Is there reason it lacks representation? Surely, and that's my politic this afternoon. There are no surprises here, because this is the power of commodity slave power. The display of that power, as Hamilton reminds us, this was the federal city was founded to be in 1790, a compromise in which slave power compromised nothing. Here's an example of soft power and misdirected blame. And this may not be Wikipedia, but you can find 100 like it. Unique among cities with a high percentage of African Americans. And I'll pause right now and I will say, I do not use the expression African American unless I use the expression European American. By and large, the persons that we were talking about since 1797 or 1800 have been our second or third or fourth or fifth generation Americans. Black Americans is what I will call them. Washington has had a significant Black population since the city's creation. As a result, Washington became both a center of African American culture and a center of civil rights movement. The italics are mine. Since the city government was run by the US federal government, Black and white school teachers were paid at an equal scale as workers for the federal government. Well, I hate to say it directly, but most of this is hogwash. And if you know your history about segregation in the city was segregated very much so through 1800 and remained under the administration of Woodrow Wilson, a white supremacist, avowed in his own terms, a Southern Democrat who had numerous Southerners in his cabinet, that federal offices and workplaces were segregated starting in 1913. I also want to point out here the blame sharing on the Southerns and the Southern Democrats. Part of my attempt here today is to make it clear that the North, as much as the South, and probably even more, profited from the manufacturing and the mortgaging and investment on the Black slaves. The situation, segregation persisted for decades. The city was racially segregated until the 1950s. It was rigidly segregated before and beyond the Civil War. Enslaved Africans, and they were African at the time, were 25% of the population in 1800. They were captive, sold, brought here, forced labor, without knowing the language, without knowing their people. 25% of the population in 1800. They were forced labor designated by Congress to build the federal city as inexpensively as possible. And one note of humor about this, that if we know anything about the government, this much rings true. The federal city derived its name, Congo of America, from this initial population of enslaved persons who surveyed, dug, transported stone, and built the city in the 10-year period allotted by Congress. These persons were then, and their descendants continue to be, effectively stateless, colonized in a country that is not their own, with no legal recourse to law or advocacy. And although by right of birth and law, they are not African at all, they are American born. Fourth, fifth, second, third, and fourth generations. To this day, the last census, DC remains a commonwealth of unrepresented citizens, 44% Black, 42% white, 5% Asian, 5% Hispanic and Latino. If the district's history and self-narrative is white, it's because it has been scrubbed white. Back to the origins, Andrew Hamilton, very quickly. To quote Robert Frost's poem at his inauguration, Kennedy's inauguration, "The land was ours before we were the land's." Frost is not correct. I did my dissertation on him, so I'm saying this with some humor. Frost is wrong. I'm going to begin this afternoon by acknowledging the weight of Anglo-colonializing history that is carried by the native peoples that are now lost to the federal city. They're the Potomac, the Piscataway, the Nutchunk, the Accounts. And here, for example, on the left, this is the Potomac, the river, looking from Great Falls, if you're in the area, looking east. Roosevelt Island is in the distance, and let's see if I can put my thing right about there. The island was once called Barbados Island, if that gives you any sense of the kind of person and population who lived there. It was a refuge for the enslaved. On the right, Andrew White, Jesuit, Society of Jesus in 1640, baptizing the chief of the Piscataway tribe. Wherever Anglo-colonial or Spanish colonial imperial forces came, the church came with them. Somebody asked me once if I thought that the Catholic Church, or in this case, was a colonial power. I said, absolutely, there's no question about it. John Smith's map in 1612. And I'm going through a little bit of this history because it's important to understand here. You see the four rivers, and this is a map here, you see the four rivers, the James, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac. I quote on it, his masterpiece map of Virginia, published in 1612, remained in active use for 7 decades. Opened this part of North American and European exploration for settlement and trade. Not to mention, and the peoples to despoliation, enslavement, and expungement. But here again, the people are lost. I want to be in the room where it happens, the art of the compromise, the skin in the game. No one really knows how the parties got to yes. We talked a little bit about the compromise. And the Residence Act of 1790 ordered a move of the federal government from Philadelphia to the Potomac Valley. It was first in New York, where Washington took his oath. Then it was in Philadelphia. Why the move? Because the soldiers in the Revolutionary War wanted to get paid, and they basically kind of stormed the Congress in Pennsylvania and said, pay us. The North didn't have the money, the Congress didn't have the money. They appealed for the government in Philadelphia to take care of it and save them, and the Pennsylvania government wouldn't do it. They decided, you know what, this is not going to work. So this is the reason there's a federal district that is run only by Congress, because Congress, even way back then, realized that if they were going to be protected, they had to do it themselves. So they left New York and they left Philadelphia, and the compromise, as you saw in Hamilton, the move was a result of a financial crisis and an anxious Congress worried about their safety. The act was, if we move to Maryland and Virginia, both enslaved states, the South would pick up the war debt. The South did pick up the war debt, and this is what we'll be seeing here in a moment. And I want you to notice that from 1746 to actually here earlier in 1696, these two ports were the major sources for the bringing and depositing of enslaved persons, which is one of the reasons why at that particular point that George Washington and Madison and Jefferson wanted, here's that Roosevelt Island again, we were just looking at, this is Georgetown, not the federal district, still part of Maryland, Alexandria over here. One of the reasons that Washington and Jefferson particularly wanted this particular area, it should be noted that George Washington and Madison and Jefferson all had plantations. George Washington had a distillery. Thomas Jefferson had his 600 slaves at Mount Vernon, at Monticello. Their interests here were not, how do we say it, indifferent. This is Thomas Jefferson's sketch of the Capitol that they arrived at that June dinner that Hamilton talks about. Okay, we'll pass on from that. So the choice of the land was not accidental. Georgetown, Maryland, 1751. Alexandria from Virginia, 1749, guaranteed easy shipping, commerce of material and person. The land ceded from Maryland and Virginia ensured that the capital was, in effect, embedded in and as a slaver economy in the South. This is the 1795 map of L'Enfant's plan for the federal capital, and you see that pretty often. Here we begin to get a little bit more into the weeds. You'll see the 10 square miles, 100 square miles of property, the Maryland part and the Virginia part. And you may wonder why, as a matter of fact, if you squint your eye and you put your hand over this particular part, that this is the map of DC as you see it. And one of my questions is when I say that the shadow is always present, the shadow is always present. So there's something here that we will be seeing. We will be spending a lot of time here in this particular area, and I want you to notice how close the water comes here to what is the federal area, which we would now call the Washington Mall. That won't remain long. We've seen that map, we've seen that. Washington's self-involved choices have received notes since. Here, for example, is a mural at George Washington High School by someone that Buckley called a Marxist. I laugh. At the center of the mural is Washington himself, not glorified father of the country, but as complicit in the country's foundation upon the enslavement and genocide of Black and brown people. You see here the Western moving Anglo persons, you see the Native Americans, and Washington is here surveying. Of course, the black surveyor, Banneker, is nowhere to be seen. There he is. Okay. Notice Banneker, a son of a slave mother, free father from Ethiopia, is a mathematician, surveyor. He's the one who wrote a very famous letter to Jefferson, basically critiquing Jefferson's politics. And just to move quickly, Jefferson had over 600 enslaved persons, and well, it's a very complicated man, and we'll talk about that. But you see here the picture of the surveyor that he did of the surveying of this island, and you'll see even in Virginia, in Alexandria, there are roads for Banneker. He is outside as they do the surveying. Okay. Just a little in interest, the District of Columbia. This is on the riverbank in Virginia, in Alexandria. And you can actually go around and you can still track them all the way around. And they have put most of them in some kind of protection sort of thing like this. The small print there says District of Columbia. And there you go. Okay, we're going to come back to this here in a little bit, but you should understand that in 1846, Alexandria has been a center for the buying and selling of Black slaves since 1746. It feared that agitation for abolition in the district would affect its trade. And so in 1846, it voted to leave the DC area and return to Virginia. Hence, leaving the district with the actual shape that we have here. So whenever you look at this map, you will see the shadow of enslavement in the District of Columbia. Okay, so the history. So what history teaches us, the buying and selling of enslaved Blacks, men and women and children, was the rationale for their federal city location. Here are two quotes. Virginia's, quote, entire economy was based on the institution of chattel slavery. Strong statement. Not tobacco, not sugar, but Black bodies. Slavery, from being an insignificant factor in the economic life of the colony, had become the very foundation upon which it was established. The further quote of that is, a stew of greed and racism and brutality helped create a substantial trade in slaves by 1812. This traffic in humans. In 1808, the international traffic in enslaved Africans was ended, largely for economic reasons. But the international traffic in enslavement could be ended without economic difficulty because the domestic buying and selling of Black people, exporting enslaved persons south from Maryland and Virginia, could replace the loss. It was the major economy until the 1860s, as we'll see. And one historian acknowledges the horror, but scrubs it of the human import. Quote, Washington offered dealers a convenient transportation nexus between the upper and lower South, as the city connected to southern markets via waterways, overland roads, and later rail. Also, as you see, it scrubs it of the North because until probably the mid-1800s, Rhode Island was the larger was the larger manufacturer and shipper of enslaved persons from New England into the Caribbean. The domestic buying and selling of Black persons greatly surpassed the original numbers of peoples transported directly or indirectly to the colonies. This is a surprising statistic. But Congress outlawed the importation of kidnapped enslaved, partly because the South in the Constitution wouldn't have it any other way. But they could do it because the slave population in the US nearly tripled over the next 50 years. Because, as Jefferson would put it, of increased domestic increase, in Jefferson's own language and words on the productivity of it, I'm sorry to say, of his breeding slaves, his language, we'll come to that. But the buying domestically of stateless persons within the US, why do I call them stateless? They were Black Americans. They were under no law. They could not come to law. The case that we see of Northup later on, 12 Years of a Slave, the case was dismissed because as a black man, free black man, Northup could not come to the law. But this continued into the 1860s. Removed by force, 1.2 million people, men, women, and children, lots of children, from home and family. And the vast majority of these persons were born in the United States, as we'll see, after the last importation of African captives. By 1850, most US citizens, third and fifth generation. Okay, there's gonna be two graphs here this way. I'm gonna actually pay attention here to this. And from the 1840s, between 1810 and 1860, at least 100,000 enslaved persons were moved either north or south through the District of Columbia generally, every decade. And in the final decade alone, during the 1850s, in which everything was coming to a head, 350,000 lives were destroyed. And I repeat again, all of these people in bondage were born and raised and died in the United States. By jus solus, they were citizens in every way except for legal case. And you can kind of see in both the North and the South, I mean, in both upper and lower, the increase in slavery and enslaved even after the importation had ended. Very visually, you can kind of see the lower is the colonies, and the top is the colonies, and the lower is the states. You can kind of see the increase just by looking at it. And this is after the importation in 1808 has ended. I want you to notice over here, this purple space. This is Andrew Jackson's 1830, the Indian Removal Act, because it was discovered from as Caribbean enslavers came into the lower South, that this area was perfect for cotton and sugar and rice. So Andrew Jackson basically violated the treaties of the Indigene, or the Cherokee, I don't call them Indians, the Cherokee, and moved them here, as you can see, here. It's a shape that you may recognize. Andrew Jackson, see Lafayette Square. His politics, the Indian Removal Act 1830, are not just a historical problem. This is Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, one of his first judgments. Today, we are asked whether the land these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for the purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. Would that the past had held the government to its word. Washington Post, 2020, July 9th. Supreme Court rules that about half of Oklahoma is Native American land. And again, you guys can Google this. The point again, of a lot of what I'm trying to say is that our history is not dead, that our history and our past has consequences even today. And we see it just serendipitously in this issue here. In Virginia, in Alexandria, two slavers, Isaac Franklin and Armfield, leased a brick building on 1315 Duke Street. You have probably driven by it 100 times, as a holding pen for enslaved people being shipped from Northern Virginia to Louisiana. They were shipping 1,000 people annually, owning one of the largest slave trading companies in the United States until 1836. And when they left, Birch took over. You see his name on the front. He was the one who kidnapped a free black off the streets of Washington named Solomon Northup. You know the story from 12 Years a Slave. The man was enslaved for 12 years, later brought suit against Birch. The case was dismissed in DC because, again, a black person could not bring a law, could not enter a court a law against a white. This is an off-street view of the Franklin and Armfield slaver pen in Alexandria. You notice in the year 1860, this is Matthew Brady, and we know his Civil War images. When we're speaking about the Civil War, we rarely, I think, put the two of these, we talk in a very general way about, well, was it to end slavery? It wasn't, but what you're going to be seeing through here are a number of actual images of the time, and this is particularly one of them, Franklin and on-field dealers in slaves. As many as 1 million people are thought to have passed through the federal city between 1828 and 1861. A reminder, in 1808, international trade was forbidden. In 1828 and 1861, there was a three-time increase, 66% increase of enslaved persons from the time of the passing of the Constitution on their way to bondage in Mississippi and Louisiana. The ad is as it is. Cash for 500 Negroes, including both sexes from 12 to 25 years of age. I'll repeat that, 12 to 25 years of age. Can you imagine? Persons having likely servants to dispose of. Notice the word slave, enslavement, is among the more genteel, not used. In the Constitution, the word slave is never used. You see this word, servant. Will find to their interest to give us a call. We will give higher prices in cash than any other purchaser of these people who need to be disposed. April 6th, probably 1820, 1825. No, probably 1830, I'm sorry. On the left in the corner, if you have children yourself, if you're a teacher, if you know children, you know them. Bill Keeling, male, 11, 4-5. Elizabeth, female, age 10, 4-1. Monroe, 12, 4-7. Lovey, age 10, 3 feet 10 inches. Robert, 12, 4 feet 4 inches. Mary Fitchett, along with the last name, which is interesting, one of the two. Female, age 11, 4'11". And this is not even to talk about Thomas Jefferson, as we'll get to there. These are actual items. You can find them in different museums, and you can astonishingly find them on Etsy and different places where they are being sold as souvenirs. And I have all kinds of opinions on trafficking in this stuff, and so I try not to do that here, but to simply use this as an example. The barbed wire collar is used as domesticated animal or enslaved human, and I have to say that my work here, this comes out of a history of doing animal justice and for non-human animals. The 1857 horses, mules, and dark African niggers is inscribed on this collar. It's not my language. And note the year, it's 1857, so the more accurate term would have been American. These are not Africans. They have been, by and large, born and raised here in likely Virginia or Maryland. You may remember this. And so my question then, I would ask in my American Studies classes, so why is a racist minstrel tune about a Black slave who's taken away from his home, shipped down south, why is it recognized as a state song emeritus? Why, for example, can Governor Northrop, in a 1984 yearbook from Eastern Virginia Medical School, have a photograph like this? And what kind of culture does this happen that it's like, oh, well, no big deal, or better, we don't see it. But enslavement is not a Southern problem. North and South each profited from the economy of blood. And later on in the series, I'm going to be doing a thing more specifically on the North, not tonight, later on. And here, the word stock reminds us of what I was just talking about, animal, non-human animal, livestock. The stock market, 1711, where do you think the name came from? 1711 law by the Common Council of the City of New York, December 13th, 1711. Law appointing a place for the more convenient hiring of slaves, that all Negro and Indian slaves, I don't have a lot of time to talk today about the indigeny, but from 1619, when we talk about the first African slaves were brought in, there had already been 125 years worth of enslavement by colonial and Caribbean of the indigenous Indians. All Negro and Indian slaves that are left out to hire within the city do take up their standing here at the wall. whereby, this is the red, all persons may know where to hire slaves as their occasion shall require, and also masters discover when their slaves are so hired. You'll notice here that an issue is that many of the slaves did not actually have work as an agricultural and plantation. So even as we saw with the opening of the District of Columbia, the enslaved would be hired out. Somebody would pay for them, but that the quote owner would pocket the money. Here's where it gets a little tough. The weight and power of words, and they say words, the sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And we know very well that when we want to do damage and don't want to take responsibility, we use language. So why was the federal city moved from New York to Georgetown Harbor? Let's talk about the enslaving presidents. Enslavement may end with a chain, but it does not begin with a chain. Words begin the work. Behind every act of violence is a justification that through law or some other kind of powerful word. Words are weapons and they enforce power. This is the work that words do. And this is Hamilton's America. For 50 of the 72 years between the election of George Washington and the election of Abraham Lincoln, a man, in this case a man, who owned and sold black slaves was president of the United States. A man who owned and sold black slaves was president of the United States for 50 of the 72 years. Only a slave keeper during this period would be a two-term president. 12 of the first 18 US presidents, count them. You can Google it and you can look at the names yourself. 12 of the first 18 US presidents enslaved black people at some point in their lives. 9 brought enslaved people as property into the White House. A majority of the founders of the United States enslaved people. 41 of the 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence and 25 of the 55 men who wrote the US Constitution kept, owned, retailed, or sold slaves. Astonishing figures. George Washington, 250 to 350. Thomas Jefferson, 600 plus. Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Jackson, Grant. We're going to pause here for what I call the curious case of Thomas Jefferson. And these are in order of his things: slaver, founder, guilty author of the Declaration, first Secretary of State, architect of the federal city. Yes, there was a contest to see who could come up with the best design, and he had one in himself. But he was also with Sally Hemmings, the father of 5, maybe 6 enslaved children whom he never publicly acknowledged nor legally freed. Who was Sally Hemmings? Sally Hemmings was a 14-year-old person. She was the half-sister of his legal wife, Martha. She came to Jefferson as part of the dowry for Martha. She was an infant. She was 14 when Jefferson began his, what do you call it? Do you call it a relationship? I don't have the language for it. It is certainly power. His oldest child was 14 years old, and guess what his name is? Madison. We wonder where he got that particular name and whose favor he was trying to curry. Jefferson has status as the author of the most sacred document in the US canon, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these rights to be self-evident: the right of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I want you to understand that you should go back and look at the Constitution, look at the Declaration, and notice that refers to this first line: when in the course of human events, it is time to separate. So the line, all are created with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, has nothing to do with our kind of funny language around diversity and human values. It's about why it's an excuse and an apology for what they're doing. It's a different class, not the topic here today. But nothing is more certain that Jefferson did not intend that Black people should be free in America. One of the things I keep in on my bookmarks is Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. It's a short document written in 1779 to 1882, and it's astonishing what it says, and I invite you to read it. We've all been in this place. My husband and I had one of our first dates here. The memorial, a solemn monument that I now know that I didn't know then, a solemn monument to a man who neither believed nor practiced what the monument says. Not unusual, that's what museums do. Museums are paid to remember and also paid to forget. We're looking at what's forgotten. The Jefferson Memorial, panel 3, over there on the right. There. Offers a quotation from the autobiography. However, it edits Jefferson on this point by omitting a crucial point of Jefferson, which is below in red. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. If I were teaching English, I would accuse them of having pronoun abuse. These people here are the blacks, the slaves. Nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, and opinion has drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. I'll read that again. Nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, and opinion has drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. Later on, and he writes, he said, this will cause us, freeing them will cause us never ending, but an extermination of one race or the other. And that's a quote himself in Notes of Virginia. And you can read that for your particular self. Again, Sally Hemmings, the enslaved half-sister of Martha. She was Martha's half-sister, a child of Martha's father with a slave woman. And if we talk about the sexual triangle in the United States and who has the power, it is certainly not persons of color or black women. It is the white men and slave owners who had the freedom to do what they wanted to whom they wanted. Hemmings would have been 3/4 European. This is not the class we'll talk, not the time to talk about Virginia's legal definition of white. I do that in a later series. But anyone who was in any kind of way not white served as the bottom rank of the society. Hemmings was, as an infant, part of a dowry arrangement. Jefferson understood female slaves and their future children represented the best way to increase the value of his holdings, which he called capital. In his journal, his autobiography, he writes, this is a quote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm." Again, this on the left is Jefferson's list of slaves, and Sally is somewhere on this particular list. In 1819, he's worried about increased infant mortality among his enslaved persons. And Jefferson says it was for moral as well as interested considerations that overseers should preserve slaves' lives, not for their labor, but for their increase. To put it bluntly, Jefferson was breeding Black people as he would breed cattle. He himself says, "I allow nothing for losses by death, but on the contrary shall presently take credit 4% per annum for their increase over and above keeping up their numbers." This is why the international slave trade he could end, as he did as president. It upped the increase, it upped the value of his own property. And also this is another reason why he pushed for the Louisiana Purchase, because the more places that he had to ship his enslaved persons and harbors to do that down south and through New Orleans, the better the profit would be in Virginia. It is all astonishing. And his social practice, as you see, differs from his politics. Hemmings, Jefferson's wife's enslaved sister, they had at least 5 children together, according to DNA studies. And for years, Thomas Jefferson's foundation, Monticello, denied all of this. And it really wasn't until 1998 when they had actual DNA that finally the Jefferson monuments and the Jefferson foundations finally said, oh, well, all right. But you see, he was a man of his time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's always whitewashing. And on the right, you see Shannon Lanier, the 6th great-grandchild of Sally Hemmings and Thomas Jefferson, who is, as we speak, a won't say a rock star, but a radio broadcaster in Houston, Texas. And this is what Lanier says. It's worth reading. This was after the murder of Floyd this summer. This was in Newsweek. I'm a descendant of President Jefferson. Take his public statues down. I'm a sixth great grandson of President Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner. I'm a descendant through his relationship with his slave, Sally Hemmings. Despite my connection to Jefferson, he falls under the above description. There are many statues of him that should come down. He was, after all, a participant in the institution of slavery, perhaps the most notorious one among the founding fathers, not least because of the jarring contrast between what he practiced and what he preached. I said in my very first slide that wherever you want to look for scrubbed history, you'll see most of the history. I've been teaching American studies and American history for years and years and years. You don't ever get this kind of material in any of our books. You can't even read any of the documents in Washington, D.C., from government documents to Wikipedia to anything, and have any real sense of what happened in this particular town. Enslavement in the federal city, stateless people in the United States, again, are people colonized in a country not their own, with not their people, and with no recourse to any sort of law, stateless. And particularly stateless from 1857 through 1875, when technically, even if you wanted to say they were under the law, they weren't legally. We'll see. And this is the slide that you will recognize that Robert uses to advertise this. You see in the back the 1814 image of the Capitol, which went through a couple of rebuilds and built by the enslaved. And most citizens, North and South, slavers and non, publicly distanced themselves from the daily ambiguities of holding people captive. Thomas Jefferson did. He would always talk about how nature has made them different, but he would not specify and say, oh, you know, it's going to be the death of us and we can't free the slaves and we're stuck with it. Everyone had an excuse. Everyone had something that, well, you know, it's not really our fault and what can we do about it? And so, well, it's really bad and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of virtue cheering, you know, we're going to build monuments, we'll take care of them, et cetera. We'll talk about that. There's little agreement on how to address the issue. But slavery proponents like Davis and Lee and Hamilton and Hammond knew that cotton was king. And Hammond said in 1858, no one in the world can take down cotton. Cotton is king. This was right before the Civil War. And Dred Scott the same year, Roger Taney says, no Negro in this country is a citizen. The Dred Scott decision is mandatory reading on everyone, and it should be. But the slavers knew that it would act as a vivid symbol of their grasp on the nation. They were right, as we'll see. The presence of the enslaved is impossible to ignore. What you can't see here, and maybe you can kind of see the hackles. They're chained. Typically, a coffle of slave would be chained at the neck and at the leg, and you see them here chained this way. Okay. The home of the oppressed, there's the Capitol. And the bronze dome tells you that it's before 1846 or 1856 when it was burnt. But as you see, you have a coffle, which was a technical word for a group of enslaved persons, men and women, and you can even see children. When they were going south or north, as the case may be, they did go north, they marched, they walked, usually. If they died, they died. But as a matter of fact, they were usually not welcome with public transport. And so they would basically walk down what we now know as Highway 1 from DC through Virginia. And they would stay at Armfield's slave pen. And you see here that the point that this is an abolitionist kind of screed, and the point that the abolitionists were saying, and the thing about most abolitionists, many of the abolitionists were northern persons who were not profiting any longer from enslavement. So in other words, when it became clear in New York that the profit in keeping enslaved persons was diminishing, then it becomes, oh, well, it's time that we should be. So the moral posture of abolitionism is a complicated one. I want to address here 1836, the gag rule in Congress. In 1836, a rule was passed because every year they would bring some kind of motion. It's like the HR 40, the bill for the District of Columbia statehood, which is, again, before Congress this last summer. But the gag rule in Congress was that they could not, it was overwhelmingly a one-sided vote, that they could not bring laws against the enslavement into Congress. They would not be heard. This was in 1836. A Brooklyn historical document, a broadside condemning the sale and keeping of enslaved blacks. Slavery, slave market of America, and you probably can't, I don't have much detail here to see. You have, it features the Declaration of Independence, the Capitol that you just saw, the map of the district, federal district with slaver power in it, which we will look at. The second row is the Alexandria slave house, the the Washington, D.C. prison, the auction market. And the D.C. prison does something now that actually the state of Georgia just started doing again. It would rent out its enslaved for money. And I forget the state law in Georgia, but it was just passed in 2014 that hired out inmates, and what I call neo-slavery, hired out inmates, and the government took the profit. The last one again was the slaver pen in Virginia, Alexandria's harbor, and the O'Neill House itself. It's worth actually Googling that yourself and looking at that. So how we lived here in Georgetown, and you're going to see versions of this because Georgetown always, in views in Washington seemed always to be facing west. I still don't understand why, but we'll begin to see, you'll see over here, this is you see actually how this land is kind of cut in here, and this would be the Georgetown here, and you can see Georgetown University in the distance. More whitewashing. Georgetown is a neighborhood founded in 1751. Actually, it was incorporated from Maryland in 1751. It was probably founded by the Pascatanuich in the 1600s. The first Anglo or the first British colonizer would have been 1696. Unlike other historical sites, Georgetown is a living museum with thriving residential and commercial immersive experiences, continues to evolve and serve as a mirror on changes to the larger society. There's a certain truth to that. And again, I want to recall the politics of a museum. A museum is a government, a culturally approved memory, and someone is paying that museum to remember as well as to forget. All right, those of you who may know the area and who might like to get out sometime and actually take a particular walk, this is the CVS on Wisconsin and O Street. Across the street is the slaver pen, as it was in 3138 O Street, Northwest Georgetown. The rock you see here that's been used in the back wall of the CVS is this rock. The Louisiana Purchase that Jefferson was so hot to make, and the cotton exploited the possibilities of industrial cotton presentation. And so the increase of the enslaved through Washington really occupied in Georgetown, however of a certain class it is now, was of a different kind of class until 1850, 1860. Which is to say, as someone comments, there were now 5 full-time Black congregations and churches, and maybe 50 Black people who live in Washington, in DC, who live in Georgetown. So Andrew Stevens, the editor of the New Statesman, who was doing some work in his house, starts realizing that as they're digging up the basement, he finds bones. Somehow I could not leave it there. Who were these people? How did they come to be in my house? Why are there 5 all-Black churches flourishing in Georgetown, but fewer than 10 Black inhabitants left in the current population of 4,800? The population has decreased slightly since then, and this is 2006. This is 3138 O Street. It later became, before this, it later became a bakery, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So the increase into Georgetown Harbor and K Street, what we now know as the waterfront. This is Potomac Street below Cno Canal, and you can see here, you can see the what do you call it, the bridge, whatever, I'm forgetting its name, but this would be the water particular front. And this is the Cno Canal. We'll see that again in a moment. The area had its own nomenclature: Hungry Hill, Paradise Flats, Frog Island, making up the overall area in southwest Georgetown, known as Boston. On the right, this is where most of the what we call contraband, the fleeing refugees from the South came during the war between the states. And they basically had an area here that no one went near them and left them alone. Like Washington City itself, Georgetown became a haven for contraband refugees. Between 1860 and 1870, Georgetown Black population increased from 1,900 to over 3,200, and the citywide population increased 3,800. We know this now as Dean and DeLuca in 1795, and years following, it was a famous market and a slave auction. And eventually it was torn down. A slave auction, I should back up, I should say a place where, I'll be direct, Black bodies, male and female and children, were put on a block in front of usually white men with money, usually naked or underclothed, where the persons watching and participating basically could do whatever they want to test the property. The problem with the language that we use, the transatlantic slave language, we hear all of this so much that we forget that there are people attached here. Eventually, the Dean and DeLuca, or the preliminary to Dean and DeLuca, was torn down and replaced at war's end. And in 1865, perhaps an attempt to scrub its history. One of my recurring themes here is that beyond 1865, you will see a major work in redoing, removing, cleaning up. I'm saying scrubbing a history that not only are the documents scrubbed, but the town itself and the buildings. But the building that we have here is what stands more or less now. Negroes Wanted. Again, those of you who are familiar with Washington, D.C., you know the Georgetown Theater. The building on the left was the very notorious Beatty Slave Pit. Okay, and down the street, if you could see it on the edge, here would be the CVS, and behind it would be the other slave pen. Negroes Wanted. Persons wishing to dispose of Negroes from 10 to 25 years of age. Both sexes can obtain cash for them by applying to the subscriber. Last line. A smart, likely girl, 11 to 13 years of age, would be desirable. Think how long ago this was, folks. This is not so far. So the Beatty Slave Auction Block, 1351 Wisconsin Avenue, which became this, and this is what it looks like now. Georgetown University, 1789, that if you Google Georgetown University's college seal, you notice that it looks almost like the state seal of the Constitution, which was also 1789. And why it becomes part of what we're doing here. During the Civil War, soldiers in Virginia, you can see Georgetown in the distance. In 1838, Georgetown University sold 272 of its slaves, basically to pay bills. This in red is the man who did the selling. He was a priest and the president of the Georgetown University at the time. Know all men by these presidents that I, Thomas F. Maletti of Georgetown, District of Columbia, have bargained and sold, and by these presidents do bargain, sell, and deliver unto Henry Johnson of the parish of St. James, state of Louisiana, the following Negroes. Full disclosure, I'm a priest myself. I'm at Georgetown University. The larger church, the bishop and the Vatican had told the Maryland Jesuits, they were called Roman Catholic gentlemen, they weren't called Jesuits, that they could not do this. They did it anyway. And again, we'll see that Georgetown at the end, what they have done for reparations, and I'm very impressed with what they're doing. But you see a picture here of Frank Campbell and two children. And of course, the question that I'm always asking is, where are these people now? What do we know about them? We don't. Something of a local color. This is Francis Pool in Georgetown, which was one of the first full-length open size pools designed specifically for Blacks in the District of Columbia. Georgetown and the district had their own Black Code, which was published in 1848. It's astonishing to read. Any slave before the hour of 9 or after the hour of 5, bathed in Potomac, shall be publicly whipped. Any slave shall fly kite. Such offender will be punished by whipping. Watching a cockfight, punished with 39 lashes. Last one, any free Negro, mulatto person living in the town shall have his or her own possession any written or printed paper. Okay. A point here that the disposition of the Negro residents of Georgetown, says the Conference on Better Housing Among Negroes, is jointly managed by the city's leading realtors and their allied banks and trust companies. All right, I'm going to ask you to take about a 30-second break and give me a minute.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us while we're waiting for Ed to return. Just as a reminder, so this program is being recorded and it'll be on our YouTube page a little bit later. It probably won't be up till tomorrow, though. So I posted the YouTube link in the comments section, or the chat section, I should say, but I'll also email it as well. And thanks for joining us today. It's been really fascinating reading everyone's questions and comments that have been coming in. And what we'll do is we'll ask Ed some questions at the end of the program. So thank you very much for that. And this is actually the second time he's delivered this presentation. It was so popular the first time. He came back for an encore performance. So Ed, I was just keeping the crowd warmed up while you...
Good, and I am sorry.
Turn it back over to you.
Those who are doing homeschooling understand that we have dependents at our home, and we promise those who are dependent upon us a good life. So
no problem. It's all good.
That's okay. So this is the federal district. We were looking at Georgetown specifically. Georgetown, as I said, until 1751 was part of Maryland. It was incorporated into the district. We're going to be looking here now at this particular area, Georgetown again over here. This was the picture or image we saw earlier, the Piscataway, looking east at the island of what we call Roosevelt or Barbados. This is the Cno Canal. The Cno Canal, which was built by enslaved for the point of moving enslaved materials and residences. This is the picture again, and you see the Cno Canal where the enslaved contraband from the South, basically as refugees, stateless refugees. And the Army gave them a title, contraband, which is booty stolen from the other, or kept from the other enemy. We're going to see here now a couple slides. We're going to be looking at how the city or the federal district then began to build a canal through here with 3 different terminuses. What you want to notice here is that where that arrow is right now where about the Washington Monument is. So if you're a citizen of DC, or you're familiar with the map, you'll notice that this whole tidal basin is not even here yet. This is an 1860 image of the Cno Canal, and you'll notice that probably the images here, the photographs are probably, the oldest one I have is maybe 1832. It's just beginning to become a thing. The original Washington Canal opened, again, built by enslaved. This is going to be the Capitol. This is going to be the Smithsonian Institution. This is going to be the Washington Monument. And you're saying, oh, what is all of this? Well, it's all water. This is where Constitution Avenue is. Okay. Until 1800, 1881, it was a canal, a pretty stinky canal apparently, and everybody was throwing everything from dead bodies to whatever else into it. And once the Potomac flooded and the waters came all the way up into the Capitol, and they said, oh, nope, time to move the canal, and they did. Again, there's that western view. And when Washington was originally designed, it was currently West and East Potomac Park, a wetlands here. And you see just here, basically, from the Smithsonian Castle Tower, the view of the Potomac Flats and the incomplete Washington Monument, about which we'll speak in a moment. Here's that image, and you can kind of see already where we're going. Now it's been redone. This is the Jefferson. This is the Washington. So all of this has been added. This is the old stone house on the corner of 17th and Independence, or Constitution, excuse me. And it's the Lockkeeper House, and you can still see that vestige of original DC. And this is the west or the eastern end of the canal in the waterfront in Southwest that you can actually still see. An 1856 image. The Smithsonian Castle has just been completed. I'm sorry, this is an 1885 image because the Washington Monument is up. And you can still see the water and Georgetown off in the background. You'll see down in here will be the Botanical Garden. This is going to be Independence Avenue. This will be Pennsylvania Avenue, eventually. And I show you these pictures because who did all the building of this? The enslaved. The Washington Monument was completed in two phases. One private, 1848 through 1954, which clearly the enslaved persons built, and one public, 1776 and 1884, where probably Black workers did the work. Slaves were likely in all areas of construction: carpentry, masonry, carting, rafting, plastering, glazing, painting. And slaves appear to have shouldered alone the grueling work of sawing logs and stones. Here's again a wonderful image, at least, of, I think it's 1856. And you can see the canal, which is now Constitution Avenue, that's going to go all the way. And the politics around this particular time, because as we will see when we get to the Smithsonian, there's a detail. 1856. This building is just finished with some uproar. We'll talk about it. The Smithsonian Castle was built bluntly by George Washington's slaves. Actually, they were his slaves or his family's slaves who would have been freed by his will. George Washington changed his mind about slavery, and although he had teeth that he, quote, purchased from slaves because he had very bad teeth, later in his life, he realized that he did not want to be a keeper of slaves, and he put in his will that they should be freed. Most of the enslaved persons, however, were part of the dowry for his wife, and she did not free them. But across from the, now if you can envision this, if you know Independence Avenue, so where you are at the Smithsonian Castle, directly across the street is William Slave Pen. Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, who is a trustee of the Smithsonian, remarks, "It is the house, William Slave Pen, by which all must go who wish to reach the building of the Smithsonian Institution." Well, talk about slaver power. Jefferson Davis, later president of the Confederation. "It is the house, William Slave Pen, by which all must go who wish to reach the building of the Smithsonian Institution." So we just talked about Martha Washington and the property and her enslaved and their family. Much of the stone, the freestone, came from a Maryland quarry, which were where her enslaved both basically were and grew up. And this is simply an image of Mount Vernon, and this is an image at the same time of 1848. In the time that the Smithsonian was being built, and I'm going to come back over here to this place, a major escape in Washington, D.C. 77 free and enslaved adult and children unsuccessfully attempted the nation's largest single escape, free and enslaved. They left K Street Harbor on a schooner, Pearl, got all the way down to the Potomac River to Point Lookout, and they were brought back, held captive in Blue Jug, and we'll see where that is. And the alderman, the chief of the Board of Aldermen, writes this letter to the citizens of Washington saying, well, we have everything under control, and those desperate criminals are in prison, and it should never happen again, and you are safe. Okay. Now I want you to understand that by this time, 2 years earlier, the retrocession of Virginia has happened so that they were able to be taken back through Alexandria, because Alexandria was still able to buy and sell the enslaved. And these are the girls, the Emancipation sisters, and their freedom was purchased later for $4,500. And you see here they are at a conference up north for freed slaves, and that's Frederick Douglass. This is the Blue Jug. If you know the National Building Museum, you may have a vague sense of the shape of this particular building. It was a famous, or more, I should say, infamous prison in DC, where enslaved were taken and very often forgotten. Some of these have been what do you call it? Skipped, but unfortunately it's not skipping, so I'm just passing over. The Congo of America, so called because of the numbers of enslaved persons exploited in the building of the city. This is the capital, all right? And I'm going to mention, we're going to talk about where President Obama took his oath of office and what he could see from this particular point. And this is the Capitol Inn, the National Inn, a slaver hotel that had basically a prison in the basement and basically offered to insure any enslaved and pay full value if they were stolen or escaped. And then you have over here, you have Lafayette Park, what they call the President's Park. These are all the major areas within walking distance of Washington, D.C., of the capital here, of the Washington slave trade. We could spend a lot of time here at the Lafayette Park because it's really amazing. Lafayette Park was called the President's Park. It was a central destination for slavers. It was a cemetery, it was an auction block, it was a market, it was a bazaar. The president's lives and businesses, often with captive blacks present, went on and outside the window. And if you ever want to read Frederick Douglass's description of this, and Frederick Douglass can write better than most people that I know, it's incredible. In the beginning, in the middle, Andrew Jackson's statue built by an enslaved person. Andrew Jackson, whose politics on the indigene, the Native American, was basically slaughter them, move them out of our lands. You know, the larger question also that we've been asking in terms of it, the current mayor, who is just doing a fabulous job from my particular point of view, and who just lost her sister to COVID, I should say, so may she rest in peace. But she has been very careful about so much of this. The DC, under her leadership, now has what they call DC faces. And so they're routinely going through the monuments and the names. And a question that I've asked before on this is, how many names of Black people do you know in Washington, DC? I think Frederick Douglass finally got himself a bridge. But there's very few. And you see the, again, like Jackson and the memorials. This is Madam Mayor's Black Lives Matter. So, you know, a curator from the Smithsonian says that 99 years before Trump's cleared Lafayette Square to walk to St. John's, enslaved people were kept in slave pens along Independence Avenue. So just to put some focus on what we're doing over here, that this was slaver power. 8 out of 12 presidents enslaved Blacks here in front of the Capitol, in Washington, D.C., where they had the power because they could. To paraphrase President Obama, because they could. So again, if you're looking at the Capitol, just, and again, you can find this slide on Google, different places, but the various places that were famous or notorious, and we're going to be talking about these two over here by the Hirshhorn as we go. This is what we would call Roby's Pen, which is now where the FHA is on Independence Avenue, and the Constitution or the Congress would be in the past. You see the couple of people being carried through. Capitol in the back. For decency's sake of the representation, people here are dressed. You see the army and the soldiers in behind. The Fugitive Slave Law in the 1850 Compromise, which again was not a compromise, the North kept appeasing the South. It kept appeasing the South in Congress. It just did. And the Southern slave owners and slave power, Henry Hammond is an example, Judge Taney, the Supreme Court is another example. We'll talk about it. But the Fugitive Slave Law actually said that that anyone could commission or deputize a citizen to take a slave back to his owner or her owner. Solomon Northup was a violinist living in Philadelphia. In DC, he was kidnapped off the streets by Birch, enslaved for 12 years under the authority of the US Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Law. This is the slaver's justification. This is from the US Constitution. And I know this sounds like Downton Abbey. No person held to service or labor. They'll repeat it, service or labor, service or labor. The Constitution never says the word slave. That doesn't mean that they ignore it. They do not. They go out of the way not to mention it, but not to ignore it. John Adams later freeloads the Amistad slaves, captive slaves who had been kidnapped from Africa, who couldn't speak a word of English, who took over the Portuguese boat that they were on. And then they ended up in Connecticut. They were brought before the Supreme Court as escaped slaves. And John Adams basically said, no, this is America. We don't have slavery in America. Read the Constitution. So by looking at these particular words and not being mentioned as enslavement, they got off. So this man, you know the book, you know the movie, and it's a wonderful movie in the sense that it does not let the viewer, it makes no contract with the viewer. That is to say, excite me, but don't tell me how, because it tells you exactly what it's doing. This is the Birch, the man who kidnapped Northup, the man who was not blamed. He was brought to court for the kidnapping. The court denied the claim because Northup, this man, a black man, had no stay. The word is he had no legal sight in the court. 1315 Duke Street. I saw a couple of Virginia people here in the thing. This is the interesting slide. We talked so much about how Alexandria was part of the district. The line at the district was K Street. On one side of the line, you're in Virginia. On the other side of the line, when it was the District of Columbia, you would have been District of Columbia. This is the current house from here to here. This is what it looks like now. And so, of course, whenever the property was sold, it was like, slave pen being sold, you know, it would be Long and Foster or whoever would be selling it. All right, I'm standing across the street from the Hirshhorn, and I am at the place where this man was captive and held captive. And it's in front of the FHA. And you can see this. It's the Williams, what I would call there are two of them here right next to each other. The Williams, the big yellow house, and the Norwood slave pen. Alexandria. Now, the next slide is going to be telling. And the economics of enslavement give DC its current shape. And we talked already about this. July 9th, 1846, Alexandria retrocedes or returns as a formal part of Virginia. Why was this? Because with the increasing movement toward abolition in the district. Now, abolition of the sale, that is to say, to be polite, if you were trying to find a certain substance or product in the United States, there's some states that will sell it, some states that won't. DC was trying to outlaw the buying and selling of Black bodies in the district. Alexandria, that makes its money on it here, said no way. So they backed off to Virginia, a slaver state, where they continued doing their sale. So if you wonder why DC has the shape that it does, the doctrines and practices of enslavement are still visible, even when erased. February 25th, 1861. 7 weeks before the first shot of the Civil War on Fort Sumter. I'm going to read this. Sheriff's sale of free Negroes. I'll read that again. Sheriff's sale of free Negroes. This is what I meant when I talk about stateless. It did not matter. It did not matter to you whether they were free or technically enslaved. Sheriff's sale of free Negroes on March 4th, 1861. Court day, I will proceed to sell at public auction in front of the courthouse door for cash. All, again, why would they do it in front? Because they could. All free Negroes who have failed to pay their tax for the years 1859 and 1860. A little transition here to the war. This is Harper's Weekly's depiction of Lincoln reviewing a parade of 23 New York regiments on July 4th, 1861. This slide over here, February 25th, 1861. Fort Sumter firing, April 12th, I think it was, 1861. You see the White House as it was in 1861. April 16th, 1862, Lincoln signs a bill, not his bill, that ends the enslavement in the District of Columbia with compensation. It was written and sponsored by Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson. Passage of this comes 8.5 months before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which, if we don't know, I'll take a moment here. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a legally empty act. That is to say, he frees the enslaved in the South in lands that he no longer has any kind of jurisdiction over. It was the same kind of maneuver that the British Tories in 1775 offered the slaves at the time. If they were to leave the slaves and come to the Royalists, they would free them. So Lincoln's guess here, Lincoln, with the North was losing the war, and Lincoln's bet was that if we could get even symbolically, the enslaved persons to come to our side, we might have a chance. The Slavery Code of the District of Columbia, ironically, was published the same month. See Georgetown in the back. Frederick Douglass, former slave, outspoken leader of the abolitionist movement, who was freed by money from Great Britain, something on the order of $755. He had support from Britain to free him. Marshal of DC from 1877 through 1881 calls on Black Americans to join the Union Army to fight for freedom. His two children, Charles, his two younger sons, oldest sons, Charles and Louis, joined the fourth. And this is the Shaw Memorial. Fugitives, fugitive Black Americans fording the Rappahannock River coming towards DC. William Faulkner has a wonderfully moving short story about the South and the Union Army, and Union Army not knowing what to do with the thundering, as the text says, the thundering herds of footsteps coming behind them of enslaved persons who no longer had a home, Emancipating the enslaved never came along with a free ticket to Best Buy or anything like that. They had no money, no home, no land, which is why in 1865, at the end of the war, it was very easy to re-enslave these persons, maybe pay them $2 a month to do with the work that they were doing before. So while owners were compensated in DC, enslaved persons were not. They made do, as they always did. So between the ravages of war and the DC Emancipation Act, an immigrant in DC crisis developed. The grounds of the Lee estate, who was nationalized after Lee left his Union post and became a Confederate general. From 1863 to 1888, a self-sustained village for former enslaved persons called the Freedmen's Village. Sojourner Truth meets with Lincoln over the plight of these slaves. They become contraband. What Lincoln knew and when. It's interesting that Lincoln would have been staying at the old soldiers' home, which is up here at Shepherd and about the 2nd or 3rd Street. He wasn't living in the White House, but he would commute back and forth. And there were two major contraband camps. One here where Garrison High School is now, and then one here at about Barker at Q and 12th. so that when they do digging and work around this particular area, very often they will find, something we'll talk about later, bones and persons whose names are forgotten and don't know where they went or whose they were. So, but Lincoln's own politic of enslavement, and Lincoln said to the New York Times, if I had to free the enslaved, if I had to free the slaves to save the Union, I would. If I had to keep the enslaved to save the Union, I would do that too. He changed his mind on that, and he wasn't like Jefferson and the rest of the 19th century people. He was for they should all go to their home, quote, Liberia. Well, the point I'm making is their homeland is here. Liberia, for 99% of these persons, is not their homeland. All right, I'm going to go back here. Douglas is the invited speaker at the installation of the Emancipation Memorial in Lincoln Park, and it has to be said that it was paid for by former slaves, nobody else. The monument depicts Lincoln holding a copy of Emancipation Proclamation, freeing a male slave, modeled. The ex-slave is depicted on one knee, about to stand up, one fist, shirtless, broken shackles. Frederick Douglass sniffs and says, showed the Negro on his knee when a more manly attitude would have been indicative of freedom. There's a certain thinking about the gendering of the narrative of freedom too that I handle in a different issue. After the murder of Floyd in June 2020, was under police observation, and I was there recently. There's no longer under fence, and there's no longer under police guard. Eleanor Norton Holmes announced plans to introduce legislation to remove this from Lincoln Park. This was in June 23, 2020. She said, the statute fails to note how enslaved African Americans pushed for their own emancipation, an issue that we'll talk about at a different time. This is a copy in DC, or in Boston, that was ordered to be removed July 2nd, 2020. So we're coming to pretty near the end of what we're talking about here, but where are all these lives? In a historical narrative that erases them in a town that has developed them out of sight. The National Mall sits on the former site of the city's most bustling slave centers, auctions, and markets. Its redesign in 1902 was motivated, I think, in part to submerge the racial history of the capital. The current Senate debates about DC statehood and H.R. 40, a proposal for a task force on reparations, continues the political apartheid that has governed the nation unspoken since 1705. Truth and full disclosure, those are my politics. I put it in red. H.R. 40, a proposal not for reparations, a task force for them, can't even get through. Continues the political apartheid that has governed the nation unspoken since 1705. 1902, the Macmillan Commission basically redoes this whole area, changes all that we have seen, and basically erases it out of sight. We built the city. This is one of the earliest shots of Pennsylvania Avenue. Enslaved persons built this road. They were marched in chains and shackles down the road where Congress and presidents conducted business. This is Lincoln's funeral cortege, April 1865. This is the Capitol before it was burned by the British in 1814, and something you never read in your school books. Why was it burned in 1814? Because the Americans had burned the Canadian capital at York in April 27th, the year before. So this is how big boys play war. One burns down one capital, the other burns down the other. As a view after the Capitol burning on the 24th in 1814, enslaved persons rebuilt it, bringing quarried brick and stone from Aquia Creek in Virginia near Stafford, and you can still go there to this day and see the stone and see the quarry. The 1846 US Capitol, and this is just an interesting photograph, and I point it here because of the copper dome. And it was removed in 1856 after an interior fire. And so you'll begin to see buildings now of the dome being rebuilt. 1858, shortly after the removal in 1856, the Capitol under reconstruction. The politics, again, of this. 1857, Henry Hammond in Senate. Cotton is king. No one in the world dares threaten cotton. 1857, the Judge Taney's Supreme Court decision on Dred Scott, and around the corner of the war. Preparation for Lincoln's first inaugural. Philip Reed, a 39-year-old slave from South Carolina, who cast the model of the Statue of Freedom that sits on the Capitol dome. The architect in Italy, who had no idea how to get this large piece up here, they depended upon this man, self-taught, Philip Reed, to actually do the work. He was a slave. He was lent out or rented out for his skill, and his owner took the proceeds. It was completed in 1863. He would have been free at that particular point, but likely Robert was not invited to the opening of the Congress. So back to Mr. Mama in the western side of the Capitol. So the western balcony of the Capitol, where Mr. Mama and other presidents take the oath of office in 2009, is the location of the tent city, you can see it, for the Black builders of the US Capitol. And at least 400 of the 600 carpenters, masons, artisans, and skilled laborers, more than 2/3 were enslaved Black Americans. There were carpenters, masons, artisans, and skilled laborers, and they're likely rented. The White House was built by slaves, the depressing but hopeful story. I think that's a Fox News headline. From the construction site of the White House, the enslaved laborers were forced to witness all around them, as I said earlier, the trading and selling of other enslaved. Across the street at Lafayette Square, the President's Park, the slave pens stood out in the open, and they called them slave pens. It's like, sheep pens or animal pens. In other words, the White House was erected by slaves in the middle of a slave bazaar. Michelle Obama. It's a story that I witnessed every single day, the First Lady said, when I wake up in a house that was built by slaves, and I watch my daughters, 2 beautiful Black young women, head off for school, waving goodbye to their father, the President of the United States. There are 2 points that I want to make here. One of the points is that until this 2016 speech, you rarely heard any of this kind of information. And also it should not be lost on all of us that the school to which her children are going are not in fact the segregated schools of Washington, DC, that through and the segregated schools of Washington, DC were one of the 5 cases that went before the Supreme Court in the Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. James Hoban, this is the original design for the White House. Of course, Jefferson had one too, but he lost. Hoban rents his own enslaved persons out for the task of building it, and he takes the profit. 1846, one of the earliest known photographs of the White House, President Polk's first year in office, he brought enslaved persons with him as part of his own personal property. 1792, Cornerstone. 1817, burning of the Washington Capitol, White House. The quote on the left is just a few lines. I'm gonna ask everyone who's hearing this, please to Google this case and read it if you do not know it. Because the difference between segregation and apartheid is the law. This is not segregation, this is legal apartheid. From the Supreme Court's memorial decision, Dred Scott, Sanford versus Scott, 1857. The Negro for more than a century before had been regarded as beings of an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Judge Roger Taney, majority decision, 1857. These are the Obamas and the People's House. And it was this reason that Birch's case Northup's case, the black man's case against the man who held him captive for 12 years was thrown out of court because the white man had no rights, the black man had no rights in law that the white man was bound to respect. Roger Taney's portrait until a few months ago in Congress. So who were these people, men and women and children, who lived and labored in this place? What happened to them? You know, there is a flurry. I don't mean harm by it, but there is a flurry of what I would call virtue cheerleading. We put memorials up and we do things like I'm doing here, like this, and we look at our past, and it's like watching the film Glory, and there are folks, you know, in the film weeping at the film Glory and how terrible it all was. It still is terrible. It's not a question that this is any better, and we come to that point later in the end, and that I am trying to find ways, and this is one of them, of moving ourselves past issues of being, as Martin Luther King called it, a cheerleader for justice, and doing something concrete for it. In 2012, Congress unveils a marker to commemorate the important role played by laborers, including enslaved Black Americans, in building the United States Capitol. What am I saying? Congress should do better than that. Congress should free the current citizens of Washington, D.C., and give them representation, but they won't do that. So in life, these persons were stateless, although they were born here as citizens. They're unhomed, displaced, things for purchase. The expression things for purchase, Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the subtitle was The Man Who Was the Thing. So in death, where are they? Who are these men, children, women, born in the city and country, who spent their lives and their human care in this place? What happened to them? This is Mount Zion Cemetery in Georgetown. Georgetown, by the way. The home of 5 Black churches in Georgetown, where 4% of the current population is Black. Why all the Black churches in Georgetown? Where are they buried? The northwest corner of Holyrood Cemetery, Catholic cemetery in Georgetown, where there are no grave markers, where the graves are most numerous. The first burial ground of what was originally called Trinity Church Upper Graveyard, the Church of Presidents, Good Catholic Church, upper class, Georgetown's church, Trinity Church's cemetery set aside for burial of the poor. Hundreds of parishioners of Holy Trinity Church in Georgetown who could not afford the price of burial, much less monuments. And they don't even rate, what don't they rate? It's a blank space. Oops, sorry. A forgotten African-American burial site, this is a headline from the newspaper, could be hidden in Washington, D.C. Little is known about the burial of enslaved early free Blacks of the District of Columbia. In the Middle Atlantic region, enslaved persons on rural properties were traditionally buried adjacent to their own families. You go up and down the South, you see that. Evidence is growing that a pre-Civil War African-American burial ground is buried beneath a historic street full of $1 million townhouses. This is not far from the Francis Pool that we were just talking about. Closer to where I live, graves beneath the park in Adams Morgan. The 5 major cemeteries that have been, again, moved for reasons of usually commodity building, the Mount Pleasant Plains, Columbia and Harmony Cemetery, the Moses Cemetery in Bethesda, which was walled off from Black people for years, and which has now been paved to make room for parking lot, and Lord and Taylor, okay, and a former plantation in Loudoun County. So this, if you go down Columbia Avenue, right off Columbia Avenue off 38th Street, this is a Quaker cemetery, which is probably where they're looking at a cemetery beneath there. And this is where I have some more of my energy. Woodrow Wilson Bridge, under construction in 2006. The unmarked Black slave cemetery is to the left of the dirt area in the lower corner. Wilson, an unapologetic white supremacist, segregated Washington, D.C.'s federal offices within 2 months when he was president. I drive up and down I-95 often, and there you go. Woodrow Wilson's kind of service plaza. I read the various quotes and acronyms for Woodrow Wilson, and you know what? It doesn't deliver half of what this man did. So here, the irony is that in life, he segregates them, and in death, he basically eliminates them. People get ready, there's a train a-coming, a crisis in civility. This is, by the way, this is the whites-only neighborhood called Detroit Park. And the reason the gate was here was basically to keep Black people, to be blunt, from getting into it, actually. And it was only broken down by dint of Howard students who basically made it a mission to basically move into that particular area. President Woodrow Wilson, March 4th, 13th through 21 during the war. Quote, the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had been sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. You may recognize where this is from. Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith. Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton, who just recently had his name taken from the Princeton building. It's an issue. We talked about Jefferson's grandson. What do you do with the statuary? I teach courses in European continental ethics, and I have told every school I teach at, I said, take the statues, have them keep the statues, put them in museums, but change the curriculum. There you go. This is not segregation. This is apartheid. All right, this is Washington, D.C., 1919. Extra patrols, closed streets, ordered to check rioting, battlefield, 1919. Red Summer. If you're watching Watchmen, you see a version of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1920, 21. 1919. Riots again and break out in the national capital. Marine kills Negro. 2,000 troops in Washington. Rioters quiet. Washington aflame with riot. This is the nation's capital. We haven't seen headlines like this since January 6th. Sorry for my politics. Wards 2, 4, 6, 7, first. And always the disaster zone, whenever these things happen, is right in here. And why is that? Every one of these shots is a view of the Capitol. People get ready, there's a train coming. Capitol in view. Following the death of Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968. You can see again the map, 900 businesses, millions of dollars and lives lost. This is 7th Street. This is O Street. Okay, you wonder why? I'm speaking to you from a property right about here. The purple area are lands, real estate under restrictive covenants. That is to say, these are places that the real estate agent would sell the house, the home, the property, and as part of the deed, as John Kennedy knew in Georgetown, would be a covenant that said that it would not be sold to a person of color or a Black person. The Supreme Court outlawed these in 1948, saying they wouldn't stand up in court, but as a matter of fact, is it still done? It's still done. The purple are the restricted. The brown is where persons of color or Black Americans, in terms of the segregated DC, could live. And you can begin to see the differences. 1990, 2000, 2006, 2000 now. So you can see where the movement is going for persons of color and Black. The weight of history. We began with district markers. We're going to end with social apartheid very quickly. Mount Zion Cemetery, we saw this. Enslaved persons fleeing Virginia would have paused the night at the Mount Zion Cemetery because it was one of the first stops on what they call the Underground Railroad before continuing north or west into abolitionist territory. Washington was never a destination until the contraband. It was a thoroughfare. This is a corpse cooling, sorry to put it that way, but a place where they would store the corpse until they could dig a tomb for it. This is where the Black escaped slave would hide out. Sandy Spring, the Underground Railroad was not just a symbol, it was a real thing, and you can, as a matter of fact, go underground and see. Harriet Tubman, escaped slave herself, came back for 30, 40 years and escorted other folks onto freedom. Here's my comment. Why would you put Harriet Tubman on a bill when Black commodity has been the problem, that the domestic buying and selling of Black bodies for money? Surely this is a little tone deaf, and perhaps to do honor to her, maybe we could do something different. Like, I don't know, I don't know that, but it seems to me that's like putting Marshall, what do you call it, Frederick Douglass on a dollar bill. That doesn't seem to me to make much sense. It seems not to understand that there was a commodity in buying and selling, and capitalism and slavery go hand in hand in any text. I refer you to Eric Williams' text, Capitalism and Slavery. By the way, people get ready, there's a train coming. If you listen to what they call, quote, Negro spirituals, you'll get it. It's all about movement, it's all about the river, it's all about what's happening, it's all about being in the place at the right time. It's essentially code. Frederick Douglass says it better than I do. The Fugitive Slave Law, 1850, makes mercy to them a crime, bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery, and $5 when he fails to do so. Frederick Douglass. This is why Tubman does not belong on a bill. Okay, so we have Black people in Washington, D.C., and we can then say, so what happens to these particular people? Professor Lowen, in his wonderful book, Sundown Towns, and you think, you've seen it on, Earl Warren or Earl Wider, Don't Let the Sun Set on You. We think it's kind of like some fiction out of the West. Actually, it's not. Black men don't let the sun down on them. Sundown towns are white only after dark. That's a real thing. And it's not just for Blacks primarily, we'll see. So sundown towns, places where are racially, I'll say it, more than segregated. There are laws, covenants, and different legal situations that Black people cannot be. Okay, Washington, D.C. So you have the map of Washington, D.C. in your head. These are the towns around it. Those of you who are not familiar, Chevy Chase is north and west. Greenbelt is north and east. And Mount Rainier is way east of Washington, D.C. Brentwood, Chevy Chase, Greenbelt, Mount Rainier, University Park, or Maryland Park. These are sundown towns in one way or other that have restricted covenants or laws in place to restrict the movement of Black people either in their town or from coming to their town. And this map is copyrighted by James Lowen and his staff. You may have seen Lovecraft Country, which talks a little bit about this. Okay, sundown towns. It's not just Black. Japs keep moving. Wir wollen keine Juden sehen unser. We will not have Jews. Jews are not here. White only after dark. And why do I put those two that way? Just to show you that, from across the ocean, we share some things that perhaps we would not wishing you were sharing, but the culture, a certain kind of racialized culture is transnational. Marshal of the District of Columbia, Frederick Douglass. He's called here, it's so funny, he's called here Fred Douglass. I can't imagine anyone calling him Fred Douglass. Goodbye, Columbus. Goodbye, Judge Tawney. The Baltimore Statue of Columbus at night into the sea. Judge Tawney's from the Capitol, summer in 2020. Why Columbus? Oh, don't get me started. That's for next week or 2 weeks. Columbus in 1495 returns to Spain with no gold, but brings instead 5 ships of Captus Indigeni Teno, who later were transported enslaved to various colonies. From 1495 until 1619, a robust exchange and trade in indigeny carried on through the Caribbean and the colonies. This is why people will call Columbus Day the Indigenous Peoples' Day. And why Judge Tawney? Well, read the Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, and you'll figure this out. We're coming to an end here, and John Punch, an African man renamed by his master, was brought to Virginia in the early 1630s as an indentured servant, and that's the word that was used. He escaped his master along with 2 European servants, also indentured. All were captured and returned. The 2 Europeans, Irish, received 3 additional years of servitude, added to the usual 7, which is an Old Testament figure. John Punch received servitude for life. This, in 1636, is the first legal recognition of a life condition called slavery. I'll repeat that. In 1636, the first time the word slave appears in law in Virginia is the case of John Punch. 1705, Virginia begins to harden up its laws from 1636 to 1700. In 1705, the VA slave code defines white as the legal line to citizenship. Long story here, but essentially it's very different than the Caribbean model, where mulatto and mixed and mestizo were persons who were mixed race themselves would have a leg up into society. In Virginia, any mixing, 1 drop and you're out. Mr. Punch has a surprising descendant, and maybe you can recognize him here. President Obama descends from the first African enslaved for life in America. Obama's biography, son of a Black father from Kenya, white mother from Kansas, suggests that unlike most African Americans, his roots did not include slavery. Not so. He's related to John Punch through the white mother, not Kenyan father. All right, last section. I apologize for my young dependent in the background who's irritated that I'm not paying him attention. Justice and restorative justice. The Freedmen's Bureau, established shortly after the Civil War, began the planning for Howard University, and Oliver Howard was the first chair of the Freedmen's Bureau. The US Congress chartered Howard on March 10th in 1877, 1866. It was the first significant effort at reclamation and restorative justice by Congress. Would that there had been others that followed it. But for much of its time, and I think still today, Howard University receives somewhat silently, I think, money from the government by virtue of this. I'm surprised that the government doesn't make more of a deal about it. You see the 2 buildings over here, the main hall on the left and Minor Hall on the right. Minor Hall here was, quote, the first normal school for colored girls. Normal school meaning the equivalent of I don't know, not a high school, but a lower grade school, and it would have been a segregated school. Rank 6, and you see our vice president here on in the second row. Shaw, if you know DC, segregated. Bowling versus Sharp, one of the 5 cases in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. The segregated schools in Washington, D.C. were one of the cases in Brown versus the Board of Education, just so that we are clear on this, that D.C. was not a kind of a haven for Black people. And that when Wilson segregated the federal government, the town itself had long been segregated. I'm going to pass on these, are not particularly, this is here. John Lewis, Edmund Pettus Bridge, March 7th, 1965, RIP, July 17th, 2020. A former president had no words to dignify him with. 23rd Amendment, 1961, first voting for DC citizens. President Clinton's parting commentary to the district 200 years later, DC residents still exist as stateless persons, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic. Washington Post, DC statehood, a story of racism, taxation without representation, and the GOP. Why does DC not have representation? William Buckley argues in Why the South Must Prevail, 1957. He later changes his mind on this. White Americans are, quote, entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail, politically and culturally, anywhere that they are outnumbered because they are part of the advanced race. You saw Hamilton. This is the Electoral College. This is James Madison. Remember that Jefferson names his child after James Madison. Names his Black child after James Madison. Quote, there is one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the North than in the Southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed, on the whole, to be liable to fewest objections. Yes, the Electoral College is intended to keep the district white. When DC received home rule after the war after the Civil War, in the first election when so many Black citizens became elected, Congress removed home rule from them until probably 1980 or 85. In 1838, we see a Roman Catholic gentleman of Maryland sold the slaves and used the money worth $3 million to pay off debts and build his campus. In 2016, the university is engaged in numerous educational and material matters of reparative justice. The community at large, more specifically to the descendants of the enslaved persons who have been sold to retire Georgetown's debt. So the past is never dead. It's not even past. The thing I want to say about Georgetown, even Georgetown students now voluntarily tax themselves every semester and use this money as scholarships for persons who want to come to the school. And so is it time for some sort of restorative justice? I think so. And we can't, like Jefferson, wring our hands and say, on one hand, as we drink our lattes from Starbucks with using the labor of persons from Peru who are picking the beans, that we can't simply rub our hands and say, well, we don't know what to do and there's nothing that we can do. We need to start thinking about things that we can do. The recent HR decision in Congress for the state of Washington, DC, it will be named State of Washington, this Commonwealth. In 1970, the Black population was 71% of the city's population. By then, many white residents moved to Virginia and Maryland where they could enjoy full rights. 1800, Blacks were 25% of the population, and they would have been African at that point. And the majority of them were still enslaved. The consequences of that are still evident. DC lives do matter. I've always loved Audre Lorde. Your silence will not protect you. And I want to thank you this afternoon for being part of a solution. Thank you for your patience, and any errors here are my own, and you can hear my little dependent unit in the back who's very happy joining. And Robert will be able to give you an email or a way to get a hold of me should you need to. But this is what 51st State will look like, Douglas Wealth Commonwealth. I have to end on this particular slide because this is still the way city tour guides whitewash the city. And this is an ad and an advert, and I don't know what to do with it. This is the trolleycar.com. Okay. This is an advert for March 21st, same time, same place. And it's going to be one of 6 presentations. And this is going to be looking at the opening and development of what we call the transatlantic slave trade, but I'm going to not use that expression because as a matter of fact, it's much more complicated than that. And it's not just about Anglo enslavement, but the rest of the series will be about that. So I hope that you will join me, for those who have, I won't say an interest in the topic, but if some learning is useful, I'll be here to do that. Robert, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Ed. That was fabulous. I appreciate that. So yeah, we do have quite a few questions have come in. Let me do that. Let me try something here.
Okay.
So this is a program that Ed's going to be doing the same exact time on March 21st. It's not on our calendar yet because Ed and I just finalized this earlier today. So I'll probably post it tomorrow, and I'll be happy to email all of you. It's part 1 of a 6-part series he's going to be doing. And so again, that's not on our calendar just yet, but I'll be happy to email that to you at some point in time in the future. And then just as a FYI, a couple other things. Oops. So we have been recording this program. It'll be on our YouTube page. It won't be up till tomorrow though. So I can also email that as well, or you can just look us up on YouTube. The name of our organization is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. And let's see. So yes, Ed, we do have a few questions if you have a little bit of extra time. I know you've been very generous so far.
I'm here as long as you need.
Don't say that, we'll be here till midnight. Let's see. So here was a question that came in from our good friend Elizabeth, and you talked a little bit about the DC statehood and the problems with it and situation, but in your opinion, do you think statehood for DC will happen anytime in the future, or is it just like a lost cause? Like, just, I guess, what's your personal opinion?
Bill HR 40 has been repeated again. It was like the gag rule. It was repeated every year in Congress for years and years. HR 40 was passed again by the House. It's likely to be passed by the Congress, and we are closer now than we have been. I think it is only a matter of time.
Okay, all right, that's good. Appreciate your opinion on that.
The importance here is because to underestimate the reason there was no representation is racial, just to begin with. This was a place of enslaved Black persons that was not entitled. It was a stateless place that when citizens moved to Virginia and to Maryland so that they can have voting rights, that's important.
Okay.
In other words, and I will say, Robert, going back to the Declaration of Independence, one of the reasons the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that it says, it has taxed us without representation. So he uses the taxation without representation in the Declaration of Independence as a reason for severing ties with Britain.
That's a good point. Let's see, what about, and then also another, so some of these I'm gonna kind of combine different questions from different people into one, but you talked a little bit about some of the activities and initiatives that Georgetown University has taken to respond to the things that happened in the past. But was there like a particular turning point that you see where all these things kind of started happening, or was it more just like a slow, gradual evolvement over to, like sometimes when there's a big event in place? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I lived on campus in a building called Mileti Hall. Mileti was the man who signed off on the he was the president. This is a building in the Jesuit community. I lived in the building. Suddenly, when they began doing the work in 2006, 2007, about how thoroughly enslaved Georgetown was, and became evident in Georgetown's own property and its own history, that's when they began to move. And Georgetown has been very forthright. I mean, other schools like Johns Hopkins and Princeton and Harvard and even Faneuil Hall in Boston, they have, there's still the no but, or like the Woodrow Wilson in Princeton. Well, no but everybody was like this. John DeJoy, the president of Georgetown University, has been formally dedicated to this principle. And it was funny. I was teaching there, and he was simply an MA student, getting into philosophy. So he got himself a job, but he's been good. And the university has fundamentally put their support behind restorative justice?
This is a really broad question, so you might just narrow it down, give a narrow answer. But someone asked, are there any other universities or educational institutions that have kind of a similar background as Georgetown, like in Maryland or Virginia, that have kind of embraced this topic that you particularly find noteworthy?
I just talked about this just a second ago, and Princeton and Harvard, and most of the, you can't, that's what I mean about the North. The North is explicitly involved in this, in education and philanthropy. The mortgaging and the insurancing and the selling and the manufacturing and the stocks, that every university has this. And the ones that have come forward and are doing something about it in their own history, their own boards of controls, are Johns Hopkins and Princeton and Harvard, just to name three. But all you got to do is Google higher education and enslavement and start reading. The point is that enslavement is not simply listed something that poor people down picking cotton on the plantation down south. It is a cultural stain. And whatever we want to say about, well, the Constitution, we had to do it because it wasn't really about slavery. Is that the point is the language that the abolitionists began to use, we hold these rights to be self-evident, which didn't mean anything except that the right to freedom was what the colonists were asking for themselves from Britain. Jefferson had his son, who was his valet in his room, his enslaved son in France when he's writing this. He wasn't talking about him. He wasn't talking about Martha Washington, his wife. Women would not have been figured in this. He certainly wasn't talking about his what do you call her? She's not his wife. She's his, what? I don't know. I hate to even use the language. They do not figure in the Declaration of Independence.
Okay. And then there were quite a few people that asked if you've written any books, either on this topic or any other topics.
I've written all kinds of things. My 2000 book from the Chicago University, At Stake, Monsters and a Rhetoric of Fear in Public Culture, Maps of Heaven, Maps of Hell, Religious Terror as Memory from the Puritans through Stephen King. I do a lot of work in gender, I do a lot of work on horror, I do a lot of work on Catholic theology. And actually I got myself into trouble with Georgetown a number of times because I wouldn't shut up. How's that?
Well, how about if I do this? How about if I catch up with you later and maybe I can put this and we'll email it out to everyone and post it on Facebook as well for people that don't have a pen and pencil way by. So I'll take that on.
I should say, Robert, I talked the first gay lesbian narrative course in Georgetown in 1994. And I would say that it's a little late in the 20th century for Ivy League course to be having a course like that. And I will also say that I had to go to the classroom a half hour before class just to erase the boards.
Margaret made a great comment in the chat. She wrote, "That's good trouble to get into!" Exclamation point.
Thank all of us for being here is good trouble.
Let's see. And then quite a few people asked if there were any books that you knew of on this topic that you recommend, like the materials that you would have used to research this.
I have a list. I have a short list of 5 books that are mandatory reading, and I use them when I teach this in class. And obviously, I've tailored this to images, but for real depth in understanding, there's 3 or 4 books, 3 or 4 volumes that are the best to read. Robert, I can give you those.
Oh, yeah. Why don't I get those? In fact, for your program, you're coming up in 2 weeks. If there's even anything that you recommend for people to read before or afterwards, I could always send that out beforehand if someone wanted to kind of get a head start.
Well, you can start with the book I referenced, especially on the Caribbean, especially on the enslavement and the development of trans-oceanic enslavement by Portugal, by Spain, and by Britain, the biggest ones. And the United States was really not one of the big ones. The difficulty here is that the United States enslavement was on its own land. The United Kingdom enslavement was all on the island. So, Queen Elizabeth, bless her heart, and when Prince Harry says we need to get with our colonial history, the point is that Britain can wash its hands of it because, well, these were just on islands across the sea. We are living with the consequences of our own colonization.
Okay. And then what about, you kind of talked earlier about, or I shouldn't say kind of, you did. You talked earlier about how the people that were brought from Africa, they intermingled more in like Central and South America than here in the United States. Why is that? And then also, do you see like a difference between the situation here in our neighbor to the north, Canada?
I'm sorry, I missed that last part. Do I
Oh,
see?
why you were talking before about how the races intermingled more in like Central and South America. Why was but not so much here?
I don't know that I
talked
use
about
the word race because race is a made-up term. You know what? Even Jefferson, he would called it something different. But the Caribbean was 90% black, which is one of the reasons that the laws were so draconian. Virginia had this notion of, well, you know, we're just nice white people and these are our servants. But the more black people that came into the state of Virginia, you notice that from 1636 to 1705, there were a series of 10 or 15 laws that become very, very specific about detailing blacks here and there and what they could and they could not do. And actually, if you want to see something instructive, just go look at separationist laws in the North for black people. It's astonishing. Don't just blame the South.
And then like it was kind of like again, I'm summarizing different questions from different people, but what about this, are you familiar with like how the situation between the races is in Canada, and is it different than the US, and why is that? Any thoughts on that?
A word I use, and I talk about in the third part of the series where I talk about resistance, and I use the word decolonizing the people. The first peoples, I use a little bit of the language in my beginning when I acknowledged the colonization of the indigene. I mean, there are people whose lives are no longer here. I'm not trying to simply virtue cheerlead, but the politics in Canada around the First Peoples, for example, is similar to our rhetoric around, or our seeming rhetoric around what we would call the nations of the indigene. We don't call them indigene, I do. They're not Indians. I would prefer to call them by their names, indigene or Cherokee. But we handled the indigene very differently. We accorded them a kind of dignity and supposed nationality, never that we would do with our black citizens. Which is to say, I don't know much more than that about the First Peoples movement in Canada, except to say it's as complicated as, I remember I was teaching on Fulbright in Norway, and one of the Norwegian guests, students came in and said, do you have the same problem with your Negroes that we have with our Sami? Sami is the indigenous people in Norway, in Upper Norway. So I can't say that we share, that this is only our issue. The final movement, the trajectory of this is what I call to the white ethno-state in the end, and the movement on white separatism. It's a thing. It's not just it's not just on CNN. I mean, if you look at a thing I do on Nazi Germany and the eugenics movement and immigration across Europe and across the States, this is not simply limited to the United States.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was actually something that a lot of people had asked about. So let's see. Well, we've been running for a while, so why don't we call it a day? And then again, I'll email out in a day or two the follow-up information, and then including also the invitation to the program that Ed's going to be doing in a couple of weeks. And so thank you all for joining us, either on Zoom or Facebook or YouTube or wherever else you're receiving the signal.
Robert, if I
go ahead, Ed.
Let me give you let me pass out that whole series so that everyone gets a chance. They can see.
Oh, yeah, sure. If it's, do you want to pull it up on your screen or just read it off? What works best?
I'll give it to you, and then we pass it out. Or
okay, sure.
We'll put it on Facebook.
Okay, good. And then again, if you're watching, we'll have a recording of this on YouTube, but it won't be until tomorrow because we have another program tonight. But if you want to watch it again or send it to someone you know that will be interested, just FYI. And this has been Enslaved Washington, D.C., 1790 to 2021. So bravo. Thanks, Ed. That was really amazing. And again, this was an encore presentation because it had such a great response the first time. I think you did it in like mid-December. And so again, we look forward to hopefully seeing all of you in 2 weeks when Ed will continue the discussion on.
with my dog.
Oh, that's fine. All good. Everyone is welcome. So thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.